Hello, and welcome to this Windhorse Publications podcast. My name is Dhammamegha. I'm the publishing director at Windhorse Publications, and I'm here to talk about books about mindfulness, meditation, and Buddhism. This is our first podcast, and to kick us off, we have the first of a two-part interview with Bhikkhu Anālayo, who very kindly joined me for an early morning conversation. Bhikkhu Anālayo is a monk scholar and someone whose translations and interpretations of early Buddhist suttas have been really influential for the academic study of Buddhism, and also for people who practice the Dharma, practice meditation. He was born in Germany, ordained in Sri Lanka, and now lives at the Barre Center for Buddhist Studies, where he combines a life on retreat with prolific writing. I specifically wanted to ask Bhikkhu Anālayo about two books that he published recently. Both of them were written for mindfulness practitioners and teachers who want to know a bit more about the Buddhist background to this widely used set of techniques and approaches for greater presence and awareness. So a very warm welcome, Bhikkhu Anālayo. Good morning.
So thank you. And I've got a couple of questions for you. Let's start with some of those books that in fact came out at the end of last year. We published a series of two books that come as a pair in some ways. The one is called Introducing Mindfulness, Buddhist Background and Practical Exercises. And the other one is called Mindfulness in Early Buddhism, Characteristics and Functions. And both of them seem to have been born, if you like, out of the same wish as an intervention into into mindfulness as it's used currently. Maybe you could say a little bit about why you wrote these two.
Well, it started at doing a retreat, teaching a retreat together with John Kabat-Zinn at IMS, the Insight Meditation Society, which is kind of the most ancient and most well-known place for this traditional Vipassana meditation in the West. And we were kind of just opening this up as a space for dialogue between the more traditional Vipassana kind of community and the people, particularly MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And so we were about halfway into the retreat, and there were close to 100 people, and many of them were his close friends or students. And so in front of everybody, at some point, John just turned over to me and said, "Bhante, did I say or do anything wrong?" And that struck me very strongly because, you see, I mean, if I had that question, I would have taken him by the side, say, "Let's go outside, I want to ask you something," but not in front of everybody. And I was really touched by the humility. And then at some point, it made me kind of really think over the whole situation. And I realized that earlier I had some kind of, I can say arrogance. Because as a Buddhist scholar, I see some of these mindfulness people write about Buddhism, and it's just sometimes plain rubbish. They just don't know. And I had this kind of like, these guys don't even know this, don't even know that. And at that point, I suddenly realized, Anālayo, but you can't expect them to know that. They haven't studied Buddhism. They studied psychology, they studied medicine. How would they know? And I suddenly realized that myself and pretty much, to the best of my knowledge, most of my colleagues in the academic field of Buddhist studies, we have not really done our duty. We're just sticking in our things, and sometimes we look over there and go like, I don't want to have anything to do with that. That's commercial. They don't know. But actually what we should do is to make our knowledge accessible, particularly as there is they call it the second generation of mindfulness-based interventions, where after the first generation was very nervous about any connection with Buddhism as they were trying to establish themselves in the medicine and hospital field as something to be taken serious. The second generation is now wanting to look at these Buddhist roots. Because they realize without looking at these historical precedents, we don't really understand fully what mindfulness is, what we are doing. And so I decided it would be good if I can invest some of my time into just helping to clarify these things. And I realized that I need to do it in two ways. One way would be this more academic type of detailed research that I normally do, giving all the Chinese and lots of footnotes. But another way also to have a simple way that general people who have interest in that can just really access the main pieces of information as I understand them, of course. I have no copyright on saying this is what the Buddha said or this is the truth. I'm just saying that my way of working and understanding this quality. And this is how these twin books came about. Basically coming together and introducing mindfulness really meant for the general, someone who's done an MBSR course, for example, and says, hey, I would like to know a little bit more about this Buddhist background, but I want it simple and clear. And the other book is then more for those who are actually fully involved in research on mindfulness in the field of psychology, who are willing to go a little bit more on the academic current or level, and are willing to really look at what are all the different ways how mindfulness is used in the suttas.
So let's start a little bit with the Introducing Mindfulness book. So that one is, as you say, oriented to a slightly more generic readership, somebody who might be exposed to mindfulness in other contexts, who wants to learn a little bit more. And you've actually got, so it's sort of developmental, that book, isn't it? From introducing some of the basics about mindfulness and also, in a way, helping people to develop their practice from daily reflections, daily mindfulness exercises, all the way to a more formal, seated, in a way, enduring meditation practice that's oriented more towards wisdom. But what I found really interesting in the Introducing Mindfulness book is though it is very accessible for beginners, you're actually constantly situating some of the debates about what mindfulness actually is, what it is accompanied by, what context it comes from. So some of those I was quite interested in. So, for example, the idea of mindfulness for health. And whether or not that's a legitimate thing to do, I think that's part of the debate, isn't it? Yeah. Should we be, whoever we are, should we be using mindfulness in these ways to attend to daily problems of everyday life? Yeah, and you come out very strongly that the answer is yes.
Yeah, that this was in fact the first really major finding I made when I started in this mindfulness research, that I came across this discourse where the Buddha reportedly teaches King Pasenadi mindfulness to help him to come out of overeating. And this is just such a clear-cut precedence. I mean, it's Pasenadi, and I searched a little bit more Pasenadi, King Pasenadi, the way he's depicted in the suttas. This is just a typical petty Indian king, you know. He wants women and he wants to win his wars, and he's certainly not going to become a monk, and I doubt he will ever have really meditated. And he's just eating too much because he gets so much good food, you know. And then the Buddha gives him this beautiful passage. Manujasa satasarimato homatang janati landa bojani tanutasavadanti vedana sanikam jirati ayupayayam. It's a very beautiful short thing, and just simply basically saying that the key is to know one's measure with food. And that mindfulness is the tool for that. And the fascinating part, and it continues, there's some other people also there that have come together with the king to visit the Buddha, and the Buddha then says to this young Brahmin, you memorize this, I pay you 100 kapanas or whatever it is, the ancient coins, and you have to recite it every day for my meal. So this is actually a paid mindfulness instructor. The Buddha doesn't object. He doesn't say, no, my teachings are not for money. No, he must have taught it to this young Brahmin. Yeah. And the Brahmin then gets his money and does the job, and Pasenadi loses weight. And the sutta ends with Pasenadi stroking his body and saying, the Buddha really helped me. It's just so sweet.
It's a great image.
I mean, it is a very marginal aspect of the early suttas, very clearly. I have not found another instance of this type. It is also clear that mindfulness in early Buddhism is a very strong soteriological orientation towards awakening, no doubt. But there is also a place for this. And if in the early suttas there's place for this, then why should we nowadays stand up and say, no, they're stealing something, they're misappropriating religious property or whatever?
And presumably the motivation of the Buddha in that instance and the motivation of many of the people who are teaching mindfulness is compassion, is a response to a form of suffering.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. You have a very interesting take on compassion that is also quite different perhaps from some of the contemporary psychological research or how compassion, you make a distinction between how compassion is viewed in early Buddhism and how it is read in later traditions in Buddhism. How important is this kind of understanding of compassion to what's happening in these more secular mindfulness spaces?
But the distinction that I draw based on the early suttas actually matches very much current research in psychology.
Okay.
They are actually they're using even two different terms. They use compassion and empathy. And empathy is where you then get empathy fatigue because you're taking in the pain of others.
Right.
And they make there's a whole current of making the very clear distinction, because the doctor who has the patient in front of herself, she has to be open to get a sense of what's happening with the patient, but she should not be taking in the pain of the patient, because if she does that day in, day out, she will just get exhausted and burnt out. And so there's this necessity to navigate between becoming just blank and not really opening to the patient or to whatever suffering there's there, and making that suffering our own. Something that, to my knowledge in psychology, is very well recognized. And and this is in fact a task for mindfulness. Then it's mindfulness. She's then monitoring and seeing. This is even for me in my practice. Of course, I'm not a doctor, but like climate change, for example, or even racism here in the States. There are some very burning social problems which we have to face, and we have to do something about it, but we have to keep that balance so that we don't get overwhelmed. Because then it's either getting totally overwhelmed, or the other is then it's too much and turning away.
Yeah.
And mindfulness is the quality that helps us always stir this middle path, where the compassion is there, but there's also the inner stability.
Maybe we'll come and talk a little bit later about, in a way, the ways in which you're researching and also proposing the application of mindfulness to these kinds of issues of social and climate justice or harm. But I was interested, one of the things you say about that second book, which is more aimed at people who are researching and teaching, who want a greater depth of understanding, is one of the things that you do is outline or try and emphasize the breadth of mindfulness and what that term might cover, and the fact that mindfulness always, in a way, appears with other things, also other qualities of mind alongside them. So mindfulness doesn't sort of stand on itself, or certainly doesn't stand ethically on its own, in its own way. And you come up with this sort of characteristics and functions of mindfulness that you call Pearl, which I think is really sweet. It's very easy to remember for those of us who aren't used to remembering and reciting lots. What does Pearl stand for, and why do you draw it out like this?
Well, that's just one way of me taking up my subjective impression of mindfulness. But I think in order to get things more clear, it would be important to distinguish between mindfulness as such, a quality as such, and mindfulness in the context of the establishment of mindfulness, the satipatthanas. Because mindfulness as such can even be unwholesome in early Buddhism.
Yeah.
Or it can be, I just wrote an article on that. There's this what we call the cowherds mindfulness, which is this very beautiful image of the cowherd, he or she, probably he in the ancient Indian setting, when they had to collect all these cows from different households and then take them out for grazing. And at the time when the crop was ripe, the cowherd has to be very, very careful because the cows obviously they want to eat the crop, and so the cowherd has to hit them. But when the crop has been harvested, the cowherd can just be relaxed and watch them from a distance. And the Pali uses sati for that, sati karaniyam. Still has to watch, because these cows, if they amble off, it will be trouble, but doesn't have to stay close to them. But if our cowherd does that for his or her whole life, it's not going to take them any closer to awakening. If they become a monk or a nun, then because they have some training in mindfulness, they might have some facilitation there. But this is a type of mindfulness that doesn't have this liberating dimension. And so in psychology, they are really researching these, what are the components of mindfulness that are transformative? And there is this monitoring and acceptance theory. So they say the two main components is monitoring, this sort of like being present to a situation, attentive, and then acceptance, which is the equanimity, non-judgmental kind of dimension. And this then we can match on these qualities that come in with satipatthana, where it is, take the case of body contemplation. First of all, is kayanupasi, so contemplating the body in relation to the body, which I understand to really convey this sense of being with what is there without proliferating it, just as it is. And then there is atapi, which I translate as diligent. It's a very strong term. It has this tapas connotation of even ascetic practices. The need to dedicate ourselves to it. Mindfulness, and this is something I disagree with my colleagues in psychology. They do this intervention of teaching people for 5 minutes mindfulness, and then they start measuring the results. And I'm like, hey guys, this stuff needs a lot of time and dedication. And then sampajanya, and this is also something they don't have so clear in psychology, the need for wisdom, clear comprehension, clear knowing, this understanding dimension that I see something with my eyes, and then I understand. That is the transformative thing. And then Vinaya Lokya Bija Domanasam, the being free from desire and aversion would be this acceptance or equanimity part. But I think particularly the wisdom part is it's there in their research. Like my friend Judd Brewer, he has done this research with people who are addicted to smoking and who have tried in different ways to stop and haven't been able. And he just teaches them to be mindful. And then they watch, and then they were like, wow, this tastes horrible. The basic realization that what they have was so cool. And then they taste, and it just tastes disgusting, and they stop smoking. That's not just mindfulness, that's sampajanya, that's wisdom, that's understanding. And my pearl goes in a little bit a different direction. It's just another perspective. I mean, one is mindfulness protects us. Has this protective dimension. And this is really, I mean, whenever I run into trouble, afterwards I look back and say, brother, you were not mindful. So when I'm mindful, I have my way of stirring through the traffic of everyday life. And then every problem becomes part of the path. Then you embody. This is really important for me, especially in the West. We have to get into the body. We have to have this somatic dimension in our practice. When I was living in Asia, I found people, I didn't find this so striking because people are somehow naturally more group than individual, more in the body than just in the brain. But here in the West, people are my experience, they're so individualized, and they basically just live in this upper part of their body from the chin upwards. They're just all in the head. And so I find it's really important to come to the body, to arrive in the body, to inhabit the body, to become embodied.
Yeah.
And this is the Kaya Gatasati. This, I find that really important. Then, well, attentive, receptive, and liberating. These are more dimensions that relate more to what I just earlier discussed from this monitoring acceptance theory. But the pearl is not like the final truth. It's just one playful image and I hope everybody takes it and picks out some parts that work and leaves out other parts. I'm not having any kind of truth declaration behind that. It's just one playful image but the idea of the pearl itself, that there's something that is irritating. And then in order to smoothen that out, these covers of, I don't remember the English name now for this.
Something calcite, isn't it? I'm not quite.
Yeah. Exactly. You do it around, and out of it comes this beautiful pearl.
Yeah.
And this is the crucial difference also between mindfulness and other forms of meditation practice, such as like concentration, particularly if it's focused concentration, that mindfulness makes us really appreciate the problems in life because they're opportunities for growth.
Yeah.
We don't want the difficult people to get out so I can finally do what I want, or we want, it's all this working with conditions as they are. And precisely because of that, then more and more diminishing of this ego sense of wanting to control, wanting to have everything our way.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your method, which some people might know a lot about and some people might not, in the work that you're doing. And it's a method that's very, very generative in your sort of research agenda of comparing texts from different recitation traditions, different languages over time. Perhaps instead of me explaining what your method is, perhaps you could say a little bit about how it is that you work across these different canons, if you like.
Well, that is not really my method, that is an established method in the field of Buddhist studies. It's just that due to particular patterns and fashions that the field goes through, there has been very little attention to early Buddhism in recent times, and you need to know a lot of languages to be able to access the primary sources. And so I have just come out with a lot of work on that. But the basic idea is simply that the teachings of the Buddha and his disciples were passed on by oral transmission for centuries. And oral transmission is not that reliable. There's always chances for errors to occur. Sometimes somebody gives an explanation. It's just a personal explanation, but in the course of time, it actually becomes part of the text. And so we have different lineages of this oral transmission. One is the one that most of us know as the Pali tradition. This went from India to Sri Lanka in the language of Pali and is now accessible in the Pali Sutras. But other of these lineages also went in other directions, and we can access some of these in another language called Gandhari, which in the north of India we have some fragments because these are very mountainous kind of areas where birch bark fragments could survive for a long time and being researched. Some are in more like Buddhist Sanskrit. And then also some of these oral transmissions were brought to China, translated into Chinese. The whole was also brought to Tibet and translated into Tibetan, but then there was a persecution and it was lost, so we have only very little material in Tibetan. But we have all these Indian oral transmission lineages of these teachings available in these different languages. So by placing them side by side, somewhat similar to how people would study the Gospels, you have like certain parts that are very similar. And so there it seems reasonable that this is relatively early. And we have other parts where one is like this and one is like that. And sometimes one just sees they're different. But sometimes one sees like, wow, there are some reasons to think that this one is a later addition. And some of these later editions are particularly fascinating because they show us beginning developments in Buddhist thought, the beginning of the Bodhisattva ideal, Mahayana, the beginnings of Dharma, tendencies to ologize the Buddha more and more. There are all these tendencies that we can observe through this comparative study. And in the case of mindfulness in particular, for me, the problem that I always had was how to put all these 4 establishments of mindfulness into practice. Because the way they appear in the Satipatthana Sutta, I just didn't see a way how to combine all 4. But in many other texts, we get the mention of just these 4 and this feeling that they belong somewhere together. And by comparing with the Chinese parallels, I was able to kind of say like, oh, these are the central aspects of each of the 4 satipatthanas. And then based on just identifying these more key exercises, without taking the position that the others are like wrong or whatever, but just saying that this stands more in the forefront and the others are more at the background, I was able to bring them together in a continuous form of practice that covers all 4 satipatthanas, all 4 establishments of mindfulness.
It's an interesting project and an enduring project. You know, you've written a lot about satipatthana, mindfulness of breathing, other practices that are core in this way, looking through these multiple texts. And I wonder, you know, in some ways you're trying to work out what is earliest. Presumably that also means to some degree more reliable. I don't know if that would be if that's the case. I'm curious.
Well, I think that it is very useful to have this distinction between early and later in order to have a historical perspective. But I would like to refrain from imposing any kind of value judgments on them.
Okay.
I would very strongly object against some form of early Buddhist fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of the things we get in later tradition are just so beautiful. And I mean, there's some things in the early suttas with which I simply disagree. And I think later tradition got the better point there, maybe. So I would avoid any kind of value judgment and would simply say that this kind of early-later distinction enables us to have a historical perspective. But then where we as practitioners position ourselves, it's completely up to us. You know, sometimes the early part may be resonating, sometimes something later may be resonating. Yeah. I mean, one very simple example, I am absolutely strict vegetarian since my youth. But the Buddha was not a vegetarian and didn't even make his lay disciples vegetarian, even though they could have. So actually we owe vegetarianism to Mahayana, particularly to the Lankavatara Sutra. Thank you.
Yeah.
Important. So it's not early good, later bad. Never get into that one. That's not helpful.
Does it, I suppose I'm sort of fascinated by the position that you're able to be in through your facility with languages and your familiarity with all of these texts. In a way, I've got quite a few questions that are more in a way intellectual. I'm curious about where that leads and what the distinctions are that are helpful. And on the other hand, as a practitioner, I sort of want to ask you, like, who was the Buddha? Because not many people can get very close, have the knowledge and the familiarity with the languages to get a sense of what it might have been like to be near the Buddha, around the Buddha.
Yeah, but you see, these sources can only take us to about 2 centuries after the time of the Buddha, what people at that time thought was the Buddha.
Yeah.
So the quest for certainty about the historical Buddha is, in my view, misplaced. And when I talk about the Buddha, I talk about the Buddha basically as a literary figure.
Yeah.
But that is the more important one, actually. Because it's the way the Buddha is described in this text that has been a lasting inspiration for centuries to come and all Buddhist traditions.
So we're always imagining the Buddha.
Dhammamegha, is there anything that we are not imagining?
No. Well, not the moment you come into relationship with concepts, for example, or language, or even visual images that we have of those things. Yeah.
All our perceptions are ultimately constructed and never objective 100% reflection of reality.
Yeah.
So it's probably good not to approach anything in this black and white matter. This is reality and truth. This is just imagination. But see, it's to some degree all imagination.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't actually mean imagination in a negative sense. I mean that like we're all actively engaging with the Buddha in the ways that we can and in the ways that we have the resources to do as a figure. I don't necessarily mean imagination in a negative sense at all, but like that our imaginations more be enriched or less enriched depending on what we know. Or what we have exposure to.
Yeah, but I mean, the Buddha that we can meet in the early discourses was not interested in telling about himself. He was interested in the teachings.
Yeah.
And when Ananda was there all upset because the Buddha had been sick and he was afraid that the Buddha might pass away, Buddha said, no. Take refuge in yourself, Ananda. Take refuge in the teachings. And how to do that? Through mindfulness.
Yeah.
It's the teachings that are important, and our own practice and our own verification of the fact that, look, I've been practicing for so and so many years and I've changed. I'm a different person. Such and such defilements are still there, but such and such defilements are gone. This is really the key, I think.
Yeah. And very clear.
And then there's a deep sense of gratitude to the person who discovered and made this possible, and a sense of responsibility of myself wanting to contribute for others for this to be available. But it's not so much about this particular individual person as such.
So thank you, Bhikkhu Anālayo, for that part of the conversation. We're going to leave Anālayo here for now. And in the next episode, we'll explore the application of mindfulness to some of the main social and environmental justice issues that we face. What can the early Buddhist teachings say to us in the world we live in today? I hope you join us for that. Windhorse Publications is part of the Triratna Buddhist community, and this podcast is sponsored by Future Dharma Fund, a Buddhist fundraising charity which helps fund Dharma projects across the world, including ours. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider donating to them to help them fund current and future projects like ours. You can find out more about Windhorse Publications by going to our website.